think my earliest memories are probably around 3 years old, and I was living in the rural parts of Orange County, California. My grandparents have a horse ranch down there, and my folks lived in a trailer a few miles away, in a really rural part of the hills, and I remember kind of crawling through, tunnels of, briar, brush and stuff, and finding spiders and ticks and things, and my dad was a musician, as well as my grandfather and most of my aunts, and my dad had a band room, and I was always wanting to play with the instruments or get my hands on, um, the guitar or something. I didn't know what to do with it, but my mom really wanted to be a performer, but she had terrible stage fright, and so she kinda made it her duty to help me get over that stage fright, and so when my dad would perform with his outlaw country band, she put me up on stage with him, and he'd give me a microphone, and so here's a little, 2-year-old that, can sing Rockin' Robin or, a bunch of, old Western songs and stuff. Um, so I do remember probably traumatically, my first memory was throwing rocks at my dad's band room with my cousin Justin, and a big tarantula came out and chased us. And I don't know that I was totally unsupervised, but we had to kind of run up our porch steps and get away from that. And so most of my earliest memories are really involve spiders, but um, also being up on stage with my dad. And it's funny because now I don't really get a rush when I perform, on stage. It's actually a really calming experience for me. I don't experience stage fright the same way that people would because my mom had helped get me very comfortable on the stage with my dad, and so it wasn't anything out of the ordinary for me to get up and perform. And so one time with a group of preschoolers, we were all brought on stage at an Orange County fair, a parade of 4-year-olds, and we sang some little kid songs. And I everybody filed off of the stage when we were done, except for me. I went up to the microphone and I pulled it off, and I said, "I want to thank you all for coming to this thing." I didn't know what to call it. And then I started singing America the Beautiful, totally unprompted, without, so I had a lot of confidence and audacity as a 4-year-old, but that was probably the one that I remember the most. Um, with my dad, that was one of those things that he was performing all the time. I was probably up on stage with him before I could even sing. So just being shown off as a child too. So yeah, I think my mom really helped with the overcoming stage fright because that was something that was so important to her. And she was a really strong lyricist, poet, songwriter. And my dad was a really incredible musician, very talented singer, and had a really great band. And he actually had a lot of opportunities when he was a young man, and really could have been a superstar in the country realm. My grandfather had connections, was a 21-year member of the Sons of the Pioneers, and it was kind of just part of the family legacy that it was expected that would happen. And unfortunately, um, with my dad, he really struggled with addiction, and that was his undoing, in terms of being able to really make it in that career. Because definitely at that time in the 80s too, there was um, a lot of stuff that was attached to that lifestyle that just really, wasn't conducive to being a husband or a father, but also wasn't really conducive to being a productive artist either. And that also helped shape me as well, to see here was somebody with this immense amount of talent and support, you know, that you can see what drugs and alcohol will do to somebody and can take you down. Well, as a kid, I had pretty limited exposure to, basically what my parents were into, and, so it was a lot of, Western, outlaw, country, that my dad was really into, the songs that my grandfather would sing, that my aunts would sing. My mom was really into a lot of better like 80s rock type music. So I got a little bit of influence there with like the Pat Benatar, like Juice Newton sort of stuff. And those were the kind of songs that she was teaching me. And then as I got a little bit more autonomy, I was interested in commercial country music at the time in the 90s, which is actually really good quality songwriting. But we moved to um, the Portland area when I was 7, and just my mom and my brother and I. And as I got into school and got a little bit older, like it really was not cool up here to be into country music. And, in my early teens, the only scene that there was, punk rock. And so I very secretly liked country music, didn't tell a soul, and really just kind of got more into what was available at the time, which was like alternative rock and punk rock. And so I kind of felt like I was living like a double life where I had my roots like in the actual country, like rural Southern California, and then moving up to Portland, like more of a city life and like a different, almost like persona, to survive being a teenager. And so I've been singing since I was probably about 8 months old. I could sing full songs, and that was really where my passion was driven. And I also would write my own songs as a small child. And so my motivation in learning the guitar around 12 years old was really just so that I could play my own songs. Um, and moving around a lot and going to a lot of different schools, kind of being an outcast, I kept to myself a lot. And I used the guitar kind of as my own therapy. And because I was so shy about it too, about the guitar, I learned to play very quietly, like a fingerstyle guitar that most people don't play that way. And I rarely ever even play with a pick, but part of it was just from hiding in my room, very quietly kind of tinkering with the acoustic guitar. Well, my parents separated when I was 5. And so there was a lot of jumping around. So my mom was a single mother. We ended up leaving Southern California and gradually moving up to Oregon. And through that separation, I think that I really started to experience like anxiety and depression for the first time as like, 5, 6 year old. And um, moving up to Oregon, it was pretty isolating. And so I kind of used guitar and songwriting as like solace for that, as a way to channel some of that energy. And so, early on, I was pretty confident, like as like a young kid, to get up and sing and stuff. But I think some of the just uncertainty of my life, like, undermined some of that confidence. And, for the next, couple of decades, I think probably, I internalized a lot of that. And so instead of being more gregarious, I turned inward and was more of like the quiet, singer songwriter, turned to a more of a folk style, got more interested in introspective folk musicians, Leonard Cohen style songwriting. Um, well, I think that I don't think I actually knew that I was writing songs, and it wasn't until somebody else pointed out Where did you learn that song?" "Oh, I made it up," and I would make things up on the spot. I do remember driving in the car one time, probably about 6 years old, and singing a little kid type song that I'm pretty sure that I wrote, and somebody was like, "Where did you learn that?" And it was just something that had come out of my head. I think most of my songwriting came out of, like, observing. I would say that I was not so much, like, encouraged as a musician and a songwriter as much as expected, because it was one of those things that, like, everybody was so prolific in my family that and they were all self-taught. I think I might have been shown a couple of chords, but it was pretty much like, "Here's a guitar, you know, here's how you play a G, go figure it out, kid." And so I learned some bad habits but it got me playing and it was something that I could own and, um, you know, it w it was more of an expectation than an encouragement. It was just like, "It's in your blood, figure it out." I think, like, there's a pretty clear form with country music, and so somebody that's paying attention, can tell, like, okay, well, there's usually a verse and a chorus and another verse and a chorus, and maybe there's a bridge and another verse. Like, that's a pretty standard sort of setup for a country song, and to me, it's like how figuring out how do you tell a story in less than 3 minutes, and I loved artists that could do it, like, the fewer words, the better, and to me, it was just, like, observing masters and internalizing that. Um, I don't think anybody ever really, walked me through and taught me that until I was much older. I had, my Aunt Amy Jo was going to Nashville quite a bit and doing songwriting workshops and things, and so, I could glean a little bit off of what she had been learning, um, but I would say that wasn't until I was, probably in my early 20s or something like that, that I got a little bit more of that, like, more formal sense of what was going on commercially. Um, and I think in some ways too, like when you try to write to a format, to a formula, that it's nice to have like a boundary, but I also feel like it kind of takes away a lot of um, your freedom as an artist too. So when I tried to fit more into the that genre, um, I think it probably helped and hurt. Like who knows what would have happened um, without that influence? Because it's also one of those things that I both like love and loathe, the commercial aspects of it, and I'm not thrilled with the direction that commercial country music has gone in, which is really more of a pop direction, which is fine, it's just it's not to me true to the roots of the music. Well, I think that spending a lot of the, like, middle childhood stuff, fairly isolated, that when I did go to high school, I got an influx of friends, and I was kinda in the freak crowd and had all of a sudden went from being, like, this loner that, played guitar quietly in her bedroom to, like, having a lot of people that were interested in me and what I thought about the world and stuff, um and there was a lot of, opportunities to go out and see live music, especially in Portland with the punk rock scene and stuff, and as a 14-year-old, you could go to a lot of different clubs here. There was, like, La Luna, the Paris Theater, and, I also looked a lot older than 14. I was, like, 14 going on 25, and I also, at least according to my parents, got in a lot of trouble. I would think by today's standards, it was pretty tame. But I was also very, I had a lot of suicidal ideation. Um, and got into a situation basically that my mom was forced to put me into a Christian girls boot camp. Now, mind you, I was not raised Christian, so this was very uncomfortable for me. It was an 18-month program, and I thankfully was there for less than 6 months. Um, but it made me really question my identity. It was one of those things that was kind of popular at the time. This was like the late 90s, kind of like scared straight sort of thing where you show up and they take away your clothes that belong to anything that belongs to you, so you're wearing somebody else's pajamas. I wasn't allowed to eat with a fork or a knife, or go to the bathroom with the door closed. I didn't get to take a shower for the first 3 weeks that I was there. Um, and the kind of punishments that they do to you are they're very psychological. And so if you see somebody doing something that's against the rules and you don't tell on them, you get in more trouble than the person that actually did them. So you kind of you can't trust anyone, and it really messes with your sense of self. Like I didn't know which way was up or down, and just trying to um, survive that basically, like with some sort of semblance of self intact, was really hard. I would say the there wasn't a lot of art in that period, but maybe like some journaling, but definitely something that like shaped me, that created an experience where was totally outside of the norm. And being able to like live a whole other life, which I think later on, like as a writer, gives you perspective to write from a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different narratives, what if kind of scenarios. But coming back into the real world after experiencing something like that, um, it was like kind of like getting off a boat. Like you just don't, you don't know how to stand up straight. And I do remember. I had a job at 15. I was like cleaning um, animal cages at like the local pet shop out there, and I get there at like 6 o'clock in the morning and just like blast like alternative rock music and stuff, and just what was popular at the time. But that was um, there was a lot of anger in that music, and I think I could really identify with it. It really spoke to me then. And anger isn't really something like that. I think like at that time, here I am like a teenage woman. I don't have no control over my life, and even being angry is something I'm not allowed to do. And so that came through, with this like profound sadness, and Jewel was really popular at the time. And the kind of guitar that I was playing was similar to what she was doing. And I don't think anybody had any reference other than her for the kind of music that I was playing. So I got that comparison a lot too. um, Not necessarily because I sound like her, but because just people weren't familiar with, a lot of women playing that style of music at that time, without it being super folky. Well, I think my early inspiration from songwriters of country music and stuff, it kind of shifted more into folk storytellers, like Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen and that sort of thing. And so I kind of been inspired by that storytelling format. Like the idea that you could write a song that was 10 minutes long and like just verse after verse. That was kind of interesting to me. A lot of times writing for me was, a a therapeutic expression. And, as cliche as it was a way for me to, kind of get the sadness out. So most of my greatest inspirations have been some of my greatest tragedies. And it's kind of this like alchemy that happens where you get this thing that happens and it impacts you on such a like profound spiritual level that it like cracks you open, and you have to take whatever that energy is and do something with it, otherwise it just like consumes you and will break you. And so um my like just even teenage like heartbreak sort of thing, something as simple as like as getting your heart broken. I got a lot of really good songs out of stuff like that. And there was a lot of truth in them too, which I think I didn't realize wasn't so important too, was like in your songwriting and in your storytelling to tell something, even if it's not like true to a T, that it has a truth to it, that has something that like that speaks to you on a level that makes you feel something. So for me, it was just something that I was getting out of my system, that, I needed to take this ugly, painful thing and put it into a trinket that I could put up on a shelf, and, maybe somebody else thought it was beautiful, and maybe it was. I don't know, but to me, like, I have a different lens for that sort of thing, 'cause it whatever it represents to me doesn't necessarily represent the same thing to an audience. And I almost feel like telling somebody else what your song is about might even spoil the magic of it for them, because people find their own truths. Yeah. Well, I think most of my early writing was not for an audience. It was something that I just did for myself. And honestly, I think I was really afraid to be seen. Um, it, yeah, I think that's probably something really relatable as a teenager. Like, you don't want to show your weakness, your vulnerability. And so a lot of the stuff that I was writing then was not necessarily meant for other people to see. And, you know, jumping back a little bit, I have a memory when I was 7 years old of telling my mom that I could sing. And she's like, "I know you can sing." And I'm like, I know I can sing, but the way that I'm singing is the way that you've heard me sing is the way a little kid would sing. And I have a bigger voice." And I remember sitting in my bedroom and telling her this, and she was like, "Well, let me hear it." And I was so shy, I didn't want to do it. And then I sucked it up, and I sang for her. And I remember, like, she started to cry, and I was like, I know I have a voice. And I think that was a voice that I was afraid to show the world too. And that is, is it just the physical voice, but it is, the voice of your storytelling, of your truth, of that vulnerability. And I carried that for many years. Like, I just let it come through me. And, I had the influence of like what a song structure might look like, but use that to tell the truth. Maybe explore some other fictions that could have been truths, like the way that some more folk storytellers do, or like a historical telling of something. That's like a fun way to explore it. But when I really tried to start writing commercially, I feel like that's when it kind of fell apart for me. Like, I feel like a lot of the truth was lost for me. And sadly, some of my songs that got the most attention, there's truth in them, and they're funny, but they were never like the strongest work, in my opinion. from a very early age, there was never any doubt in my mind that I wanted to be anything other than like a musician and a songwriter and an entertainer. So even through my teenage years, like that was something that was always at the forefront for me. Like there was never anything else that I wanted to, do as a career or spend my life doing. Um, so I think that in a lot of ways it was a blessing and a curse. It is a lifestyle that is not suited to many. If you like stability, this is not for everybody. So I chose a really hard road for myself, and I chose it at a very early age. But it also always gave me something to fall back on. I always knew where my North Star was. Um, and it also led me to develop a lot of other skill sets that, come in handy as like an entrepreneur. Um, and, just as a functioning adult. Um, but, I feel like as a teen, knowing that and not still having a lot of control over my life, um, I kind of just used music as an escape, my own music and other people's, and I feel like I didn't have the access to a lot of different music either. It was one of those things that whatever was available, that's what you got to listen to. And I had a record player in my room, and I would listen to a Leonard Cohen album every night before I go to bed. And I couldn't fall asleep until I heard the last song, Take This Longing. And that was my routine for like at least 6 months of like living inside like one half of a record. And a lot of times too, like I was also doing a lot of painting as well, and some sculpture and stuff. And so exploring a lot of different art forms as a teenager. And I would live on the same half of a record for a whole day. And you just like you live in this world. It's like crawling inside of a song, and it just like it shapes that your whole experience. I don't know that many people get to do that anymore. You have so much variety and entertainment and stuff these days, but for me, it's like if I find a good song, I just want to crawl inside of it and live there, and that's my fantasy life for days, maybe even weeks. If I'm painting a mural or something like that, like I if one song inspires me, I'll listen to it over and over again. I don't know what that is, but it's almost like like there's a safety and security in that. And maybe when you don't have a lot of control over the whole rest of your world, at least like you can build this little like safe place with this song, and you can just live there. And I think that I wanted to write songs like that for myself too, that I would want to have that same experience with my own music. Let's see. So I had my first paying gig when I was 17, and it was 4 hours long. And I remember just having to make a list of every song that I knew and every song that I'd written, and to make sure that I had enough time or enough material to cover that without doing any duplicates. It was very important to me to not do any duplicates. So I put that together, and so my first gig was 4 hours long. Every other gig since has been easy, because usually they're between 60 and 120 minutes, usually a 90-minute set, something like that. So but I remember getting paid, I think I got $400 or $500 for that first gig too at 17, and I was like, this is better than a regular gig, I made like 4.75 an hour at the pet store or something. And from there started, playing like wineries and farmers markets and some pretty unconventional gigs, but I had a sound system, so I could play anywhere I wanted to. And um, I wanted to be good. I wanted to be better than I was, but I got a lot of attention. I did well in tips. I was here as this like, cute, young, kind of hippie chick. And I decided to go to music school, and ended up getting into the jazz program at Mount Hood Community College. I ultimately dropped out of that music program 3 times. Some of the hardest stuff I've ever done in my life. I was a straight A student at the community college, except for those music classes. Music theory will kick your ass, and I learned how to practice, perfect practice, and really wanted to be able to hang with other musicians. It was really important to me to be able to communicate, with a band, and be able to write charts if I needed to. And I've never really had a passion for jazz. Like, I was more interested in like samba and bossa nova. Like, that was more interesting to me, and so I kind of used that as like a gateway to get into the music and the music program there. Um, I learned a lot. Of technical things, but ultimately, I actually feel like it really didn't help me as a songwriter. And again, it was one of those things that I still feel the same way about, like learning to write commercially, where I had to learn how to do it right in order to learn how to break the rules again. Because, when you have a country background and then you start getting into jazz and stuff too, like, it's interesting, but there isn't like a really huge audience for that kind of crossover, you know. And I was able to lead a band or write a chart. And what I found, though, playing with other jazz musicians, though, is they don't like to practice as a band. They don't like to have a written part. It's all improvisation for them. So if you go and you play a show with them, they're gonna do a different lead every single time in the lead break. And my style is more like write a song, write a part, and then that's how the song goes. And I got to play around for a few years with what it's like to have a lot of really talented jazz musicians in a band. But ultimately, like, my happy place is like working with a really tight-knit group of musicians that are also close friends, that we can be vulnerable as writers together and create something that is presented, rather than just like created on the spot, which is an art unto itself. It's just, that's not my art.
Your first album?
Yeah. So my first album, I think we did in 2004. And this was before Kickstarter, before GoFundMe, any of that. I had a pretty significant fan base for, I think I was 20 at the time, and had a little email list and reached out to my fans and asked if people would like to contribute and help me create an album. I had already had a 4-song EP out at that point, so a lot of people had recorded material from me. But I raised a couple $1,000s, and I was down in LA, and there was a producer down there who, agreed to produce my work, and we were going to do an album together. And I went to his studio one time. I played a couple of songs that I was interested in recording, and then I didn't hear back from him for the longest time. And when I did hear back from him, he'd actually produced a couple of songs entirely on his own without any of my input. And when I got them, I was mortified. It was nothing like what I wanted. It was not, in my opinion, it wasn't good. It wasn't how I wanted to be presented to the world. It was very dated sounding to me, like a lot of synthesizers and things that, could have been cool, but it just wasn't, it didn't have any like grit to it. And I wasn't a part of the process at all, and I didn't like it at all. And I remember getting the bill for it, and I felt totally ripped off. Like, this is not me. And I had maybe like $1,000 left from what I had raised from my fans to make this album, and I just felt like, I failed. And I remember talking to a friend who was a producer up in Oregon, and I was still down in California at that point, and he said, "Well, what do you have left? How much do you have left?" And I told him, it wasn't much, and he was like, "Come on up. Let's make something," So I got on a train from Santa Ana up to Portland, and we ended up recording, I want to say it was 13 songs, I think. And, he helped produce them, put some of the band stuff together. And that was my first experience really doing the whole thing with production. And that album was called Not Always Sexy. And it actually got really great reviews, but it was a process, it was this thing that it didn't want to be born a certain way. It had to be born another way. And a lot of that was, based off of a collaboration that was a kindness of a friend. So that was with Eric Johnson, who still performs around Portland, and he's a really incredible guitarist and producer. And I still feel that that's a very strong album, although I question my decision on the album cover art, which is me in a black and white striped strapless dress that's really a sheet. And I'm holding this black and white guitar that I'd hand painted. It's very psychedelic looking, not the cover of like a folk album. But, I still wish that I had maybe coordinated the art a little bit different on that, but I think the music still stands. And yeah, I mean, that was the first of 8 so far. I've made several, 8 albums, and I think for me, I felt this urgency to just get the songs out there. Like, they were coming in faster than I could put them out. And more than anything, I just wanted to document them. So, my second album ended up being a live album that was a collaboration with a cellist and guitarist, George Turner, who I happened to be dating at the time. And he and I had gone on to put a band together, and we'd actually gotten a lot of attention, that group, and had some opportunities that had come up with that. But ultimately, that band dissolved with the dissolution of our relationship as well. And so, that was a good lesson about, dating people in your band. The next series of albums that I would make, I'd kind of have to recreate bands for each of the albums. And I feel like I was learning a very specific lesson over and over again. Like, it was a hard lesson. I I didn't learn it right away, and I regret that, which is that you can't do this kind of thing alone. Like, as much as you want to, like, you cannot do it alone, and the people that you surround yourself with, um, that you collaborate with, ultimately, like, you know, those are the people that um, you take with you. If you're trying to climb to the top or whatever, like, you can't step on people, and I do feel like there was a period in my life, especially when I was younger, that I was so, like, um, just focused on what I wanted to do, to be a musician, to, make it, um, that I didn't regard certain people, like, as kindly and as thoroughly as I needed to, and really acknowledge, like, how much, like, they contributed to, my art and my success. And that goes for collaborators, for producers, and for folks that really, put themselves out there and, put in a lot of time to kinda help to elevate. And, you know, I I don't think that I thanked people enough. Um, and some of those people aren't around anymore. And, that's hard. And I think that I didn't realize until about 2009, where my "Who Has Your Heart" album had come out. We had a big album release. It got a lot of attention. It got a couple of first round Grammy nominations, and I also, had interest from Sony, um, to sign me. And I did something that was, you know, frankly, I don't know, um, how else to say it, but it was shitty. And that was that the band that I recorded with did not perform at the album release and was not the band that I was touring with. And I didn't do it in a way that was graceful, and didn't give people, like, the accolades that they deserved with that. And ultimately, like, I found myself with this opportunity, and I was going to be taking it alone, and it was really scary for me. And due to my own, like, anxieties around it, and instability in my life, and managing depression, and realizing things were collapsing around me, I ultimately didn't take that opportunity. um I didn't realize, like, I was also struggling with undiagnosed PTSD at the time for some unrelated issues, and just found it, like, impossible to, like, function at any kind of a normal level, let alone a high level that would, be needed to actually do something like, you know, be successful in an industry like that, especially feeling alone. Um, and a lot of that is all through, like, retrospect. I think at the time it was something I didn't know I was going through it, and also I didn't know, like, the people that I was hurting. Um, and, thankfully, I have had a lot of opportunities to work through some of that, but it's become more and more important to me as I've gotten, um, you know, more along in this industry and in age, and, to want to acknowledge, that this is not, even though, like, it's just like, my face, my name, um, I'm not doing this alone, even when it feels like it. Yeah. I think that 2009 album, the Who Has Your Heart album, it was one of the more commercial releases, and it was also one that I felt the most, like, detached from. Um, I went on to explore a lot of different kinds of ideas and genres and stuff. And one of the things that I ended up doing afterwards was a zombie apocalypse album called Play Dead. And this was before zombies were really popular. I ended up recording it and putting it out in 2011. So I think it was written in 2009. And most of my fan base was like, "What are you doing?" Because these are all, like, old school style country songs written about the zombie apocalypse, from the perspective of the last person on earth who happens to be a country singer and a feminist. Uh, so, very niche, and, it was really fun to do and to really explore that traditional country genre and, as a singer, to play with some of the more delicate vocal stylings, like something more like a Dolly Parton or an Emmylou Harris would do, and it was a lot of fun to do, and it was a really fun show to put on, with the red glitter blood, and um, we did a couple of pretty incredible, outlandish shows that you could not get away with today, just for safety reasons. We'd had basically like people armed like coming in, storming the stage and like securing the perimeter from zombies and stuff. It was pretty fun. um but it was a fun exploration. And I think that in more recent years, though, my collaboration with Steve Moore has really been more truthful about like who I am as an artist. And ultimately, like this next album, like I'm dropping my name from the album. So it was the last album we did was Amanda Richards and The Good Long Whiles. And this one will be released as The Good Long Whiles. And for me, that's also a demonstration of like, it's not just me anymore. And I feel more like myself and more like an artist when I'm collaborating, with somebody that sees the vision, shares the vision, but a different perspective. And I think that he really helps execute the ideas in a way that um, bring it home. And my aesthetic, the style, which tends to be a little bit more on the moody, darker side of things, um, he really elevates that, with the lap steel and like these distorted banjos and with the harmonies and stuff. It's just this is what I'm supposed to sound like. That's what's in my head, and it's really wonderful to be able to do that live too, and not just in a studio with layers and stuff. So, yeah. Well, I think that after the Zombie Apocalypse album, I ended up taking a little bit of a hiatus. I met someone who would be my future ex-husband, and we spent a couple of years in Guatemala together. And I was really struggling with anxiety and depression and some PTSD, and feeling really isolated. I'd lived in isolation in Guatemala. I was robbed at gunpoint 3 times in the first 8 months that I was there, and ended up, like, not leaving my apartment for about a year after that. And when we moved back to the States, I managed a lodge on Mount Hood for about 7 months, which was also really isolating. And, I had been friends with Steve for a few years before, but when I moved to the lodge, um, he came up and started like helping out there and staying in the dorms and stuff, and we started playing more music together then, and really started more live performance together. He had just picked up the lap steel, and I really loved that instrument and was like, "Hey, come, play steel with me." And he was kind of just figuring it out and experimenting and, um, really became quite good at it. Uh, but moving back into Portland and still getting my band together and trying to figure out how to operate in this world, I was just really struggling, and I met some people that had been doing an acting class and thought, maybe if I took an acting class, I could act like I was having a good time, like around people, or figured it might help my performance if just because I struggled with a lot of social anxiety at that time, and so I basically went because it was cheaper than therapy, and I didn't really have any interest in, being an actor. It was just kind of something to do and maybe a way to meet other people. And it turned out that because I didn't really care about it that much, I was kind of able to just do it and throw it away. And that ended up being a pretty good asset for me as an actor. Um, and I also got really good at cold reading too, because I had a lot of anxiety about preparing, like, to read sides and stuff like that. So I ended up with like this skill set that was like pretty good for like cold reading at auditions and things like that. And I ended up, staying with that class for about 4 or 5 years and found a lot of great sense of community and really like learned that some of the things that I thought were my greatest shortcomings were actually some of my greatest strengths, which was that, that vulnerable voice that I was afraid to show people. Like, that actually was something that was valuable, in an acting scenario, that here you can look at, um, this character, and even though they're going through something that's different than what you've gone through, like, if you can relate it to something real, then you're bringing truth to that moment. And, after a couple of years, it really ended up changing the whole trajectory of my life. Finding that community, finding that strength in myself. I ended up, like, leaving an unsatisfactory marriage, and also like managing again this like well of emotion. um I ended up writing my first script, which was the play, Whiskey Dixie and the Big Wet Country, which I wanted to write something that was the funniest thing that I could think of. I just wanted it to be punchlines and, funny songs, and I just wanted to do something that would make me laugh, make other people laugh, and kind of help heal, the loss of that era. And it just escalated. Like, I went on a retreat for a couple of days with a few other friends and who were also working on script writing, and I cranked out the first draft in like 3 or 4 days, and I didn't know what I was doing. So I had to read a few books and figure out that I did some things wrong and try to flush out a story in about 28 tries later. I still, I still don't know that I got it just right, but we ended up putting it up as a play, and it was a lot of fun. It was, I think a lot of people had a really good time. It was very expensive. And, you know, we wanted to do it again, and it was just going to be, just so expensive to do it again. We're just like, well, if we're going to waste a bunch of money, let's just make a movie. So, I mean, it did pretty well. We ended up running it for a total of 5 weeks. We were only going to do it for 4 weeks, but we had the opportunity and the demand to run it for another week afterwards. And yeah, we had a few sold out shows. It was pretty fun. Well, the script had been originally written for the stage, like, with the idea that, this would be something that would only have a couple of scenes in it in, specific locations. This is inside of a tavern and stuff. And, it had done so well and people had wanted to see it again that, when we thought about putting it up again, when we ran the cost analysis, it was just gonna be hugely expensive, so we decided to make a movie instead. Um, you know, 'Cause if we were gonna spend a bunch of money, then might as well have something to show for it ongoing. But there was a lot of adaptation that needed to be done, and it still has a lot of a play feel to it, like that um, barroom sort of feel, which is wanting to have that feeling of being there with the characters, which I think still kind of translates into the film. Um, but yeah, it was kind of an ordeal and pretty much, gone into almost like accidentally. I did not intend to direct it. I was, starring in it and helping to produce it. And going into it, there was a lot of folks that were interested. Um, that I think could have been good. A lot of folks that were interested that probably wouldn't have been good matches. And as we got closer to these shooting dates, it became apparent that like um, somebody was going to need to step in pretty quickly. And knowing the script inside out, I didn't have experience with it, but I was learning. And um, my philosophy at the time was, uh, when I was in Guatemala, I had the most expensive haircut of my life, and it was horrible. I had to go home and like fix it myself afterwards. So going into this movie with a lot of, you know, folks with the best intentions, my philosophy was, I can screw up my own hair. um, but it was a learning curve, and but I think we pulled it off. And one of the things that we had on the set that was part of my, experience that I wanted to impart on people was to have a really good culture. So like everybody on set, we all got along really well. There was a lot of camaraderie, and I, didn't bring kind of this holier than thou sort of attitude to it. Tried to keep myself approachable, and that included with problem solving stuff that maybe was like less conventional than other directors or producers might have done. Um, but I do feel like the takeaway from that whole experience was that it was a positive one for most everyone involved. Um, and overall, I would say for me as well, I did spend a lot of time, crying in a closet, but I never let anybody see me do it. That was one thing a friend of mine who was also a director had said before going into it was like, "Don't let them see you sweat." So, um, so that was good, and frankly, I'm used to crying in closets, so it was a good fit for me too. Well, I think that my philosophy on set was, anything that goes wrong is my fault. That I was just gonna own that, and that this was gonna happen, come hell or high water. That it's all at the end of the day, it's all on me. It's my responsibility if this, succeeds or fails. And, we got through production and we made it, and we'd kind of run out of cash, and I wanted to move forward with it. I'd never edited anything before and just was like, you know what, I have the tools. I'm just gonna learn it. So I spent, a few months doing several passes, you know, because like if this thing failed, it was on me. Ultimately, I did end up, turning it over to somebody else to help me with the editing. Um, it I did get it done, but I also wanted it to be as good as it could have been too. And at a certain point, you have to ask for help, and that's just the ongoing lesson for me. Is like, being able to get out of your own way and let somebody else like see this vision from their perspective too, and we can just add another dimension to it that makes it more accessible to people. Because my edit um, was about 2.5 hours long. The play was 3 hours long, so I already, I cut a great deal out of it. I've already killed several babies. What more could you want me to do? But ultimately, I've needed somebody else to take that knife to it. Because it is like, I know people say, oh, it's hard, it's painful. Like, yeah. No, it really is. It really is hard. It's hard to let that stuff go, especially like, if you're attached to the story being told a certain way, or there's a certain aspect that really like shows who that character is. But um hearkening back to the songwriting, if you tell somebody what your song's about, it might ruin the magic for them. So maybe this story, this movie, it's not the story that I set out to tell, but maybe it's not for me anymore, you know and it's kind of up for the audience to decide, and eventually they'll get to see it. So well, the song Nashville was written to be performed by me and my band. And when I was working on the script for Whiskey Dixie, my character needed a turning point, and I just happened to have that song in my back pocket, and it ended up kind of taking over what the show was about, which wasn't necessarily my intention. Was I didn't mean to tell my story in that story. Some of it is my story, some of it's not my story. But that song Nashville specifically, talks about um like never stepping forward and never like really going into the limelight. So if I never go to Nashville, you may never know my name. And kind of resigning yourself to that fate of being a barroom singer and being okay with that. Or do I do it, and like what does it take? um and I feel like there's just so many, hundreds of thousands of musicians that have gone and been swallowed up by that industry, that, they're, waiting tables or making coffee, or, maybe they're, selling houses or being attorneys or something, you know, but that dream is still there. And it's like this kind of sad thing that, you know, would you ever at any point just let it go and let it die? And, here in Portland, like, I have a pretty good life. Like, I can, make a living as an artist here, and I've got a comfortable house, and I get to, you know, just do my thing. Like, if I went to LA or if I went to Nashville, I'd have to live in this tiny little apartment and, probably like work all the time and wouldn't actually even get to make any art. So it's been kind of a compromise where it's like, well, I get to be an artist, but nobody gets to know about me. Maybe. Um, and that maybe that's more important than like, seeking fame for fame itself is just to actually, do the thing instead of being recognized for doing the thing. That maybe it's okay to just do the thing quietly. But yeah, that song ended up being kind of a centerpiece for the film. And when we recorded the soundtrack for that, we used a different group of musicians that all had more of a outlaw country background, and um, was a lot of fun. But Nashville has a different vibe. That's more of the vibe of the Good Long Whiles. It's more uh, moody and still has a bit of the twang, but is, more of like that signature style than the rest of the Whiskey Dixie soundtrack, which is all cheeky, funny, outlaw country style music. Yeah, and so the new album, The Good Long Whiles, this new album is called Coming Up for Air, and it is more even moodier than the last album, which was pretty moody. And we try a lot of experimental textures and sounds and stuff. Um, but really rooted in it all is the songwriting. I'm always really about the lyrics and the storytelling. And so with this particular album, I think I've really stepped away from the idea of like trying to make it, to try to like be commercial, to try to sell something. A lot of the songs on it, are not radio friendly in terms of length. Like we've got 7 and 8 minute songs there. Um, it was really for us just about that artistic expression. Like let's just make the thing that we want to make without somebody telling us how it needs to be to meet some certain criteria. Um, and that's the vibe of it, is like us just playing and exploring that and making the sounds that we want to make. And we did release a single so far, Cold Rain, which was also featured on the independent film Riders on the Storm. So that one, people can get a little bit of a taste of what the album is going to feel like. And I think even the fact that we made an album, like, is telling that it's not necessarily like the temperature of what the market is now. Like, people are, basically like watching TikTok videos, and so you gotta tell your story in 30 seconds or less now. And it's just not that's not my vibe. Um, I love the experience of being able to sit down and listen to a whole album from, beginning to end, and be submerged in that world. And so this thing that we're making is really kind of a relic. Um, it's like a holdover from, you know, a time when people were still doing that. It isn't about just a one-off, just a single, just trying to make a hit. Um, what even is a hit anymore? Like, the record label is dead. Does that even exist anymore? Um, Now, we're just making art for the sake of making art. And I feel like this is so far the best thing that I've ever created. And, I've been at it a long time, and I've been proud of things as they've come out, but I've also seen, well, knowing from an early age that I always wanted to do this, to be a musician, to be an entertainer. Um, I've always had that to fall back on. I would never tell anybody, like, don't pursue your dream, even if it doesn't make sense. Um, I do feel like I've been really blessed in my life, and, I am somewhat of a magical thinker. Um, I do believe things work out for me the way that they should. I'm actually very content in my life right now, and I'm happy to be able to have a band to collaborate with, to create music with, and to perform with. Sometimes we play weird shows, it's not necessarily like Madison Square Garden sort of thing, but it's really satisfying. And, sometimes though, I think the vision that we have for our future actually is really limiting, because if I had just stuck with, I just want to be a musician, that's all I want to do, I might not have ever tried out like the acting thing, and, um, you know, making the movie for me, and the play ended up making a lot of my unique interests make sense because I was able to use all of my skill sets in a really satisfying way. I love makeup and costuming, and I love like set design, and I love anything that has to do with aesthetics, anything that's art department related. And so being on set and having control over things like that is very satisfying. And because of being so self-propelled um, early on in my career, like I've had to learn how to write press releases and design websites and do those sort of things, which is really great skill to be able to put to use when you're doing broader um, performances, or with the movie, or just be able to trust that I can figure something out even if I don't know how to do it. Like, I know that I've had to do that before, and I'll just like learn this new program and do the thing. um so I feel like the musician thing was just pulling on this thread that just unraveled this greater thing for me. And, I don't know what the universe has in store for me. But I have a feeling that being a musician is very small compared to like what could actually be my life that unfolds. Because that has been the reality thus far. That it's, even if nobody knows who I am, um, it doesn't matter. Like, I got to do it, you know? And it's been it's been very satisfying, and it has been very rewarding. And, just to keep an open mind about, you know, what your life could be, you know, follow that dream, but don't be so specific that it has to, you know, fit in this, perfect perimeter, because like this industry is changing. I don't even know if you can call it an industry, because the industry part of it, where people make money, is off of people wanting to be musicians. That's where the money is to be made. Is like, if you have a desire to be an artist, to be a musician, you're the target. You're the one that they want to get the money out of. Um, and it's really interesting because I've been around in this scene to see the shift from when that started to happen, um, and to see what it is now. And yeah, it's just, it is what it is. But that doesn't mean that we don't get to keep creating.